think there's also, we want to maximise their training, professional development, employment opportunities. You know, we are a very small country and we have some very, very bright people. And there are many opportunities within Asia for our people to go and work in Asia, but with Asia. Also to increase, that's linked to increasing Australia's export markets and our special expertise, particularly in the cultural sector. We have an incredible cultural infrastructure in this country, both physically but also in terms of people, in terms of training. We also wanted to, we want to maximise opportunities from an increasingly competitive and crowded market. And this is where I think is interesting in terms of seeing Australia as a portal for, or Europe as a portal for Australia in Asia. I guess I've always hoped that perhaps Europe might be the portal to some extent for Australia in Asia. Because whenever you're working in Asia in a cultural sense, it always seems that, you know, whenever we go or wherever we go, that people are saying, oh yes, the Swiss have just been here, and the Danish have just been, and the Goethe Institute's hosting this, and the British Council's doing this. And I guess that, you know, talking, and you run across everyone in Asia. In a sense, it actually is a meeting place between Asia and between Europe. And it's often some of the best conversations and opportunities for swapping ideas and networking is actually when you are in Asia. And through talking over the last couple of years with a lot of people from Europe who are also engaged in cultural engagement, you know, we have talked about, you know, this issue of multilateral projects, that we should not be necessarily competing with each other, but there are incredible opportunities to work on this multilateral platform, so that we go in actually as partners rather than being seen to be competing with each other. Because often we're actually, you know, working on very similar projects or have very similar objectives. And I guess that's for Australians, it's one of the great things that when you do go and you meet people from Europe, often in Australia you think you're battling away on your own, doing, you know, dealing with certain issues. What you realise, of course, is, you know, people are dealing with the same issues in Europe as well. And I think, you know, one of the key things is this concept of people-to-people relationships. And that's where the arts and culture plays such a crucial role. And it really is, I guess, getting back to what David said, is being part of the foundation and fundamental work of AsiaLink over the years, particularly through the residency program that Alison started, where we send up to 30 to 40 artists, arts managers, cultural practitioners, whether they be performers, writers, visual artists, into Asia every year. I think it is probably still, you know, the largest of such programs in the world. And in fact, the British Council will sit down with me and say, you know, we are so jealous of that program. You know, how have you been able to convince your government to support such an incredible program? And I was actually absolutely shocked, thinking that, you know, of course the British Council must be able to win that. But they said they had never been able to convince, you know, the powers that be, the policymakers, bin counters or whoever, that this was a valuable thing. And yet they say that when they're in Asia, they keep running across people who are on AsiaLink residencies. Not only that, is that AsiaLink residencies form this core or this kernel of other activities and other projects that have an exponential effect. So that most residents actually go on to develop other projects, other networks, and also actually work with other people maybe from Europe. Because inevitably, wherever they are, whether that's Beijing or in Delhi or Bangalore or in, you know, Indonesia, there are also a group of, you know, European residents as well. I think the British Council has suddenly sort of tweaked, because I did notice they were advertising, but only through the Arts Council of England, for some international sort of projects. They wouldn't call them residencies. So they're gradually catching up. But clearly Australia has got some incredible skills and knowledge, and we'd be happy to, I guess, send them an invoice for consulting on how to do that. I guess so the rationales for the engagement with Asia, you know, there are many, and love to actually talk about that a bit more. But I guess about, you know, what it is we're doing, how we actually do it. I think certainly Asia is not willing any longer to be a passive receptor of projected Western engagement. There is positive images of Australia, in the words of DFAT, which is not negative, that's you know, the perception, particularly if they're delivered by American entertainment consultants, as was the case with Australia's pavilion at the Shanghai Expo, that enables us to tap their vast audiences. And I'm still incredibly ashamed and mortified by how that actually ever happened. Certainly Asia wants to engage in the sense of what we can offer in terms of skills, knowledge, know-how, what they refer constantly to software, and by software, talking in Asia, they used to men, and still do sometimes, to both content but also the know-how. However, increasingly I've noticed that Asia is reclaiming the content space for itself. They are reclaiming their own cultural space rather than thinking they need to be importing something from elsewhere. And particularly in China, I've really noticed this in the last even 6 to 12 months. That's the nature of the conversation, but also I have to say in Korea. But this does offer up opportunities for Australia, because really what Asia wants is, it doesn't want export-oriented bilateral presentations of nation-state marketing of Australia or whatever. What it wants is reciprocity, collaboration and partnerships. And that is where the real opportunities lie. But that's where Australia needs to really seize the day. Much of our, unfortunately, infrastructure and funding structure is focused on being able to send Australian artists into Asia. There are much fewer opportunities for being able to invite Asia and Asian artists and practitioners into Australia, both in terms of funding but also in terms of the infrastructure to actually manage that. And it is incredibly resource intensive. And it's actually embarrassing when people, give you incredible hospitality when you're in Asia, but in fact, there's not the opportunity to actually reciprocate with that. And increasingly, while it's important for Australians to go into Asia, increasingly what we find when we also get Asian artists, practitioners into Australia, they absolutely have the most incredible, profound, change and concept about Australia. So I think that's a point that we've really tried to make strongly over the last 12 months, particularly in the cultural policy, but the Asia Century white paper. Certainly being in Canberra last week, I was getting that fed back to me consistently, that yes, from DFAT or the Office of the Arts, it's all about collaborations, partnerships, reciprocity, but I guess we're yet to see whether the appropriate resources get put to that. So I think that whilst there is, a place for that sort of concept of soft diplomacy or whatever, increasingly Asia is quite sceptical about those concepts. And in fact, they've actually said to me that if this is actually about, some sort of marketing of Australia or marketing of, some of the product via culture, we're actually just not interested in that engagement. You have much more to offer, and, quite frankly, Asia can actually at the moment dictate terms. I guess the last point I just want to touch on is, who are we when we, it goes to that next issue of identity, because, we do have a very strong, as you said, European, Anglo-Saxon heritage and culture, and that's actually very valued in Asia. But I think it can also lead to some confusion. Indeed, the very concept of the term, the Asian century, is somewhat vexed because it signals, to some extent, Europe as, old world and Asia as the new world. And yet, as you said, of course, culture in Europe is certainly not dead. And Australia represents, future histories. And in a sense, Australia is well positioned in this, if that is, in fact, how Asia is positioning itself, except that, as we've mentioned, Asia and Europe have much historical connections. Some of this might be a bit of baggage, but there's also shared, albeit often colonial history, but networks, influences, and as you said, language connects Asia to Europe very, very strongly in ways that we can perhaps tap into, but in ways that Australia perhaps doesn't necessarily have that very direct connection. Secondly, Asia is very status conscious. Europe has high status rating, whether this be institutions or brands, and a perceived historical authenticity that is still to be discovered and validated in Australia. And that may be controversial, but certainly that's the perception in Asia. And I think that, you know, one example I can give is that, you know, there's been often this talk about funding and why does the Australia Council put so much into the Venice Biennale vis-a-vis other, you know, Asian events. And I don't want to go down that path very much, except that I actually think that it is quite important that Australia, that has quite strong links and interventions in Europe, maintains them, because that's very respected by Asia. They see us with a profile in Europe as being a huge positive. And I think if we were to remove ourselves from that or lose that, that would be a big negative from Australia's perspective. In terms of the we, as you mentioned, yes, we have a European heritage, but increasingly many Australians have an Asian heritage. For example, one of my colleagues is developing a trained residency through Europe for writers. And in fact, when we actually looked at the Australian writers, it will be Australian writers and Indian writers. They'll go through India and then they'll come back to Australia. And when we actually looked at the writers who we'd been discussed from Australia, one was a Sri Lankan background, one was Vietnamese background, and I think the other of Chinese background. And someone said, won't that be confusing in, you know, in India? But in fact, this is the reality in terms of Australia being from, you know, Australia, who are we are a very multicultural, you know, country. But these questions still actually come up. So I think that is something that Australia, in terms of even the background of the people where we come from, can actually really, I guess, in terms of the issue of multiculturalism and in terms of searching for a new identity, really make some inroads. So I think there's no simple answer, but I think if we're exploring this terrain about Asia, Europe and Australia, then I think we probably have as much to learn about ourselves through that process as we will about Asia, and I think that's a really good thing. Thank you.